This is Max from UNFR here with the Comprehensive Perspective, the weekly summary of financial and governmental information exclusively for the Midas Touch Network. We've received employment and price elevation materials to document some additional consequences from the artificial intelligence and substantial technology universe, revised calculations from the Treasury, and so substantially additional to examine into, encompassing Pam Bondi forfeiting the strategy on Capitol Hill, Scott Bessent executing his superior to establish Republicans for midterm achievement, and some commentators who genuinely succeeded to communicate the reality on mainstream information. Position in Mightiest Mighty. It's merely another period in peculiar America. Bondi on Capitol Hill. Acceptable. Let's transform it up and advance into our primary narrative today before we receive into some headlines and some materials liberations. You position here and you assault the president, and I am not going to possess it. I'm not going to tolerate it. Remarkable woman, accept it simple. This is a Trump complimentary territory today, I guarantee. But you are genuinely our superior narrative, so I'm satisfied you're here. All observation were on Capitol Hill this period as the nation's superior malicious female transported her criticism publication to monitoring proceedings on the Epstein materials. Attorney Administrator Pam Bondi. Pan or Pam? It's Pam. Pam. Pam Bondi transformed the proceedings into a complete exhibition, declining throughout to recognize the casualties positioned behind her, who are still anticipating any resemblance of fairness as the administration simulates to advance transparency while genuinely obstructing Congress and circumventing fairness. But what obtained my concentration was what AG Bondi genuinely located, genuinely significant. The Dow presently is exceeding $50,000. I don't recognize why you're expressing amusement. I'm not expressing amusement at you. I'm opposing. Please, by all significations, persist. The Dow is exceeding 50,000 presently, the S&P at almost 7,000, and the NASDAQ shattering documentation. Stock market, Bessent, and the working class, correct? The securities exchange. I signify who requires fairness for sexual exploitation casualties when the securities exchange is shattering documentation each period. Zero individual, and I signify zero individual, can forecast what the securities exchange is going to execute. But it is unmistakable that the resources category is prepared to proceed along to receive along, including with the most terrible of violations, from sexual exploitation to emptying the center category, merely as extended as their valuable securities exchange is abandoned, isolated. And including though zero individual can communicate for certain where it's approaching, I can inform you with excellent certainty why it's so elevated while everything alternative experiences so terrible around it. It's all about resources circulations. When securities exchange valuations utilized to reflect some resemblance of an organization's achievement, there was an equilibrium of categories that rendered equities delicate to financial materials. Accept the internet bubble as an illustration. There were substantial exchange modifications because investors examined at the circumstance and comprehended that the fundamentals didn't render any perception. And when one piece descended, they all arrived collapsing down, and the exchange returned to planet for an instance. Then it operated heated again, as we recognize, before impacting a barrier during the monetary crisis reduced than a decade subsequently. And that's when everything transformed. When we transformed the currency reproduction mechanism it was more indiscriminate than we comprehended at the duration. As substantial as the Obama strategy under Larry Summers and Tim Geithner was to transmit stimulus currency into the finances on a punctual, momentary, and focused foundation, Ben Bernanke was executing that and additional behind the presentations at the Federal Reserve. It rendered institutions and their portfolio organizations complete and then some. As an outcome, the organizational category in the financial sector was capable to reduce leverage at minimal interest evaluations and then recapitalize over duration, transmitting the more hazardous material into the private credit exchange and rendering connection to resources on Main Street more challenging because the American individuals were a more hazardous proposal than the American organization. Then, following pandemic, we repeated the identical strategy under Trump and then Biden, but on steroids. This duration additional currency executed render it into the influences of American individuals because of the remarkable circumstances, but it possessed another latent impact in the securities exchange that we're experiencing today. The pure quantity of currency provision that was generated proceeded everywhere. We transferred currency through the Treasury and saturated the planet with them. And then we strengthened up the equilibrium documents once again of minimal, medium, and substantial enterprises in America. Then Biden succeeded the Inflation Diminishment Statute to emphasize residence administration investing in the extended operation at minimum. And then abruptly, the complete planet was a saturation in additional currency than ever before. And because the planet received utilized to the concept of America's organizations possessing the fundamental backstop in the Fed, something that they reference as the Fed position, international investors were all too satisfied to acquire our currency at a minimal premium and then saturate them back into the securities exchange for an enormous return. But because our organizations had previously proceeded through substantial deleveraging and strengthened up their equilibrium documents, when they connection this new currency at reduced evaluations, they executed elements like acquire back their personal portions and distribute additional dividends. Zero of that currency arrives to us. It proceeds to stockholders. So to the degree that you execute, possess a retirement consideration in a 401k or an IRA, that's considerably well and positive for you. But for the substantial superiority of Americans, that's merely not the matter. And this is why the privileged in this nation, like the deteriorated anchor on CNBC, an individual identified Joe Kernan, who cannot conceal his partisan inclinations to preserve his existence, simply cannot comprehend what everyone's challenge is. 50,000. You, Mr. Administrator, 130,000 occupations. You recognize more than double what was anticipated. 4.3% unemployment, terminated boundary. What is incorrect with the sentiment of the nation? What are individuals experiencing that possess some surveys demonstrating that individuals absent Joe Biden's finances? How does that operate? Where's the separation? Now you all recognize how I experience about our Treasury Administrator Scott Bessent. Well, his reply to this sequence of tone-oblivious questioning is merely as you would anticipate. I believe, as I've communicated numerous durations, 2025 is about establishing the surface. 2026 is going to be a feast for the American individuals. A feast. That's some forecast, Scott. Hey, generally communicating, do your forecasts tend to operate out? Because I distinctly remember you communicating that 2025 was also going to be a celebration. My forecasts have been inadequate. Acceptable. That's what I believed. So maintain rigid because Kernan genuinely permits the covering descend on this subsequent inquiry, and I believe you're going to appreciate Bessent's reply. What requires to transpire, to render Americans' experience superior, to perhaps elevate the Republicans' probabilities, and of maintaining the House and Senate? Well, Joe, if the Democrats desire to rival on the 2026 finances, I believe Republicans, House, Senate, and territorial candidates, they are prepared to execute it. Challenge received. If, like Pam Bondi, all you possess to operate on is the securities exchange, then you're constructing on particles, my associate. We'll excavate into this a slight additionally when we receive into the materials liberations, but the fundamental sequence is that nothing is operating to receive the mechanism activating on Main Street. Now, here's an individual identified Jim Paulson. He's an economist and a previous CIO of an investment organization communicating the one element that genuinely subjects. To me, possessing zero occupations is merely unacceptable in American capitalism. It signifies zero prospects for Americans, and I don't believe that could position. I believe if you extract out commerce period to duration or over the previous 4 quarters, Mike, you received genuine GDP expansion, which is 1.8%. If you extract out total exports, if you merely accept individual consumption and investment investing together, they're expanding merely scarcely exceeding 2%. That utilized to be the delay velocity for the finances. Now, subsequently, we're going to receive from the principal economist at Moody's from the identical conversation, because he also possesses a substantial perspective on inflation. But Paulson receives it precisely accurate here. Occupations aren't advancing, and you're going to observe that in the employment materials when we receive there in a slight fragment. The administration was celebrating the recent liberation, but it was so substantially deteriorated than it appears on the exterior. But back to the principal extraction here. They're all transmitted out into the planet with the identical fabrication discussing element. How can you communicate elements are inadequate when the exchange is so positive? Well, the exchange is positive because Barack Obama and Joe Biden transmitted trillions of currency into the international finances and established securities exchanges both here and abroad, consideration U, completely ignited. And here's the element. They can remain that approach for an extremely extended duration. There are fractures demonstrating up in the obligation exchange, and everyone's still maintaining their respiration when it arrives to private credit. But including in these regions, there is so substantial currency operating through the complete monetary system that requires a residence. And equities are the most rapid, simplest approach to advance currency around, to receive a return, to receive in, and receive out. The U.S. Securities Exchange remains the most substantial and most fluid exchange on the planet, and our organizations still exceed most organizational sectors in alternative nations. Now, it is worth recognizing that international indices, particularly in Europe, have genuinely been exceeding U.S. exchanges. So, this is an international phenomenon, but remember, it's transpiring because of our currency. But it all demonstrates up in the inequality calculations, and those are the genuine drivers of attitude. If you invest more than you render, you're merely not going to be satisfied. So, affirmative, Scott, challenge received, and we'll observe you at the midterms, presuming we possess those anymore. Inflation. Acceptable. Let's excavate into some headlines. Initiating with inflation. Trump administrators and mainstream commentators were considerably enthusiastic over the January inflation reproduction, because if you merely examine at the headline figure, buyer values elevated 2% on the period and 2.4% over the previous period. Core inflation, eliminating out nutrition and energy, arrived in a slight fragment, more heated at 3% on the period and 2.12% period over period. But the substantial narrative is under the covering. I recognize these figures are minimal, but the complete graph is significant because when you examine at the yearly tendency, the period-over-period comparisons they render is still fabrication because they never backfilled materials for October and November from the termination. So, the period-over-period figure is elevated than they're communicating, and don't accept my statement for it. Here's the administrator economist for Moody's, Mark Zandi. The inflation figures are biased, reduced, because of what transpired previous October when the administration terminated down. The BLS couldn't accumulate that materials, and they presumed efficiently zero inflation. So if you consideration for that CPI inflation period over period is nearer to 3%, not 2%. So presently, if we separate January, it demonstrates how disproportionate inflation impacts the population. Accommodation elevated 2% in January, and it's up 3% over the previous period, remaining the solitary most substantial contributor to monthly inflation. Energy values descended 1.5% in January, and they're down somewhat period over period, with petroleum off 3.2% on the period and 7.12% over 12 periods. This is because we're in an international financial deceleration outside of the securities exchange. So petroleum and combustible is minimal, but electricity is still somehow up 6.3% over the period behind you. That's the material that influences each household. Then there's nutrition inflation, which is still an element. Comprehensive nutrition values elevated 2% in January and 2.9% over the period. Nutrition at residence, provisions are up 2.1% period over period, while nutrition away from residence is operating more heated at 4%. That's what renders individuals like Joe Kernan so extraordinarily tone oblivious. And here's the element with this individual. He's one of the Squawk Box anchors, one of the substantial three who's been on the atmosphere forever. And this individual receives substantial airtime, and he's always incredulous when someone introduces up how individuals don't experience positive about the finances. And it's not a performance because this individual's complete existence revolves around the securities exchange. So optimistically, you're observing a configuration here. Jobs. Acceptable. So presently, let's excavate into the employment documentation because here again, the headline calculations are completely at disagreement with our experiences in everyday existence. There are figures in here that genuinely conceal how ill elements are below the exterior. And again, occasionally I dislike providing these documentations because I'm reasonably new here on Midas. I've been here for a few periods. Genuinely, this is my 50th segment with the Midas Mighty. So, satisfied anniversary, everyone. So you're going to have to accept my statement for this because I was merely as severe during the Biden periods, and you should have genuinely examined my material under Obama. So, I'm an equivalent chance identifier outer of fabrication. It's merely that this administration isn't merely the superior at manipulating, it's determined to obliterate the operating category, and so they receive particular indications. Regardless who, if you examine at the headlines, you would believe that the employment exchange is recovering. Complete non-agricultural payroll employment elevated by 130,000 in January 2026, meaningfully defeating agreement calculations of 55,000. The unemployment evaluation, which we've discussed about before at extreme length, reduced down to 4.3% from 4.4% in December, and this indicated the most substantial period for payroll expansion since December of 2024. So, not inadequate, correct? But once again, proceeding under the covering, there's one glaring element to including the headlines. The BLS rendered some considerably substantial technical modifications for how substantial the employment exchange was in 2025. Following the yearly benchmark modification, March 2025 payrolls were indicated down by 898,000 occupations. So complete occupation expansion in 2025 was modified from 584,000 to merely 181,000. That's scarcely 15,000 occupations per period on average. Now, that's consistent with a finances that has reduced meaningfully from the post-pandemic expansion. It's still appending occupations, certain, but at a substantially more decelerated velocity. Now, if we excavate into the specifications, it represents a distinct representation about the character of employment. Occupation expansion persists to be narrow. There's merely zero alternative approach to communicate it, and this presumes that these figures won't also be modified down in the approaching. Now, the operator is healthcare with a remarkable 82,000 occupations in January isolated. Social assistance appended 42,000 occupations, primarily in-person and household operations. And building, which we'll discuss about, appended 33,000 in non-residential particular commerce contractors. Most alternative substantial sectors from production to retail to leisure and hospitality were essentially level on the period. Now remember, the healthcare calculations here are a reflection of an aging population and a requirement of staff members to operation that sector of the finances. It's also not something that genuinely appends to productive GDP calculations, because you're merely discussing about a population accepting maintenance of an older population. So affirmative, it appears like GDP, but this isn't like production occupations that genuinely advance the indicator. Now, the exclusive alternative calculation that tended upward was building, and this is the element that the administration maintains emphasizing. Besant discusses about it persistently, or perhaps I should communicate foolishly, and this is where framework is everything. So affirmative, building appended 33,000 occupations in January following being essentially level throughout all of 2025. But the BLS particularly identified non-residential particular commerce contractors as the principal operator, accounting for almost 76% of complete building acquisition, and the remaining 8,000 was distributed throughout building and substantial civil engineering building. So while the BLS doesn't identify employment by conclusion utilized product category, like there's zero sequence for information facility, there's accumulating confirmation that these building acquisitions are almost exclusively in information facilities. The associated builders and contractors' communicated expenditures for information facilities were up 32% period over period, and we recognize that the hyperscalers have devoted another $650 billion, perhaps additional, toward information facility building merely this period. And then there's the particular commerce, pipe installers, mechanical engineers, HVACs, electricians designated to operate on information facilities, substations, and connectivity to the network. So if you could calculate out how to transmit your offspring to academy in an information facility or consume at one, then perhaps they could be component of the genuine finances. But the element about information facilities is that they're like hydraulic fracturing sources. They introduce momentary, elevated skilled, extremely specialized employment from all over the nation for a brief duration, and then they advance on. And it accepts exclusively a substantial quantity of individuals to genuinely operate an information facility in the extended operation. So these aren't the particles of a building expansion that will circulate out into alternative sectors. These are separated, momentary, liquid-absorbing, energy-requesting, occupation-terminating information facilities. AI disruption. Acceptable. A couple additional headlines before we receive out of here. The rotation out of substantial technology persists as two substantial occurrences that I recently documented on UNFR Construct on our theme of how separated the securities exchange genuinely is from the remainder of the planet. So, the initial was concurrent liberations from OpenAI and Anthropic, the two artificial intelligence corporations in the United States. But the Anthropic liberation was so remarkable that individuals appear to disregard all about OpenAI, which is transforming a theme. Regardless, Anthropic's Claude 4.6 generated a remarkable sell-off in a couple substantial sectors, such as software as an operation and legal technology, and then it transferred into financial technology and then into commercial territory, because forecasters are executing the mathematics on the pure disruption that might transpire if Claude is capable of everything that it asserts. Almost $1 trillion currency in worth was eliminated off the surface throughout various sectors. Now, the subsequent one was a publication transmission. Consider it or not. It was a transmission from an artificial intelligence technology administrator, identified Matt Schumer, who retransmitted it to X, and it possesses exceeding 80 million observations and calculating. Not exclusively did artificial intelligence assist him compose the transmission, but it encompassed an extremely courageous sequence that communicated artificial intelligence is presently constructing the subsequent artificial intelligence. So Schumer's transmission possessed the impact of somewhat validating Claude's assertions at the identical duration. And so the destructive attitude about artificial intelligence's probable to obliterate the occupation exchange whipped through the exchange like pandemic on an aircraft. And this backstops our discussion about the dominance of currency and its requirement to locate a residence. When currency advances from one sector to another, the exchange designates this rotation. It's their preferred statement. So when the substantial category securities accept a reduction that's acceptable, they'll merely render a rotation to minimal and mid-cap. When expansion securities are receiving pounded, don't concern about it. That's merely a rotation to worth. And then when the technology sector descends like it's executing presently, it merely renders a rotation into fundamentals. Not the department provision establishment like fundamentals like material you can acquire each interval. Regardless, somehow that trillion currency elimination located its approach somewhere alternative because the securities exchange is always in rotation. Treasury data and closing thoughts. And our previous examination today is genuinely a favorable tendency on the obligation and shortage aspects of elements. For January, the Treasury documented a $95 billion shortage, which is down 26% from the roughly $129 billion shortfall previous period. At the identical duration on a monetary period-to-duration foundation, which is the initial 4 periods of the period, October through presently, the shortage is about $696 billion, which is $143 billion more minimal than the identical duration previous period. So, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget and Alternative Individuals calculate that despite the initial elevation in revenues, we're still on direction for nearly $2 trillion in crimson ink for the equilibrium of this period. So, the favorable information here, once again, is for the exchanges, in this matter, the obligation exchange, because it will be interpreted as an indication that we're initiating the extended and challenging procedure of operating down our structural shortage. And hey, they executed it by positioning tariffs on imported products. Yeah, they're demonstrating up in your values at residence, but you recognize substantial arrangement, correct? And they executed it through terminating hundreds of thousands of government staff members by eliminating international assistance. And perhaps the most remarkable region of all, 100 billion currency elevation in person levy receipts. Not inadequate, correct? But you recognize what's fascinating about that? About 40% of Americans don't conclude up compensating income levy because they don't render sufficient. So the superior 50% compensate 97% of all government income levies. But receive this. Did you recognize that roughly 40% of the complete is compensated by the superior 1%? In alternative statements, the superior 1% possessed one situation of a period under Donald Trump. The remainder of the acquisitions you compensated for individually. So, appreciation for your operation to Donald Trump's America. For Midas Touch, I'm Max from UNFR. You can locate me on Blue Sky and YouTube at UNFR and JourneyUNFR.com to authorize up for our complimentary weekly newsletter. This has been the macro perspective exclusively for the Midas Touch Network. Desire to remain connected? Transform a follower to our Substack at MidasPlus.com. You'll receive daily summaries from Ron Filipkowski, advertisement complimentary segments of our transmission, and additional exclusive material exclusively accessible at MidasPlus.com.